And welcome into a Friday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good Friday morning to you. As we get deeper into the month of February, approaching your April tax deadline, there is some legislation that has been introduced and is on the move in North Carolina dealing with taxes on tips and overtime. House Bill 11 has been proposed to eliminate taxes on tips, overtime, and bonus compensation through an income tax deduction. You've heard similar claims echoed at the national level with President Donald Trump's campaign promise to eliminate federal taxes on tips and overtime wages as well. Representative Harry Warren of Rowan County explained that tips should not be classified as compensation, but rather as gratuity-free from government taxes. Warren said, quote, "I think it's the right thing to do. Taxes on tips don't make any sense to me at all. To classify tips as compensation, it's a gratuity. You'll see nothing you can count on if you're a waiter or waitress, a person who's relying on tips for your pay. I don't think it actually qualifies as compensation." There are currently about 550,000 service sector jobs in North Carolina. Through a number of individuals with sector service jobs is likely lower because many people work two jobs. Brian Balfour, the Senior Vice President of Research at the John Locke Foundation, expects the changes to benefit a decent number of working-class North Carolinians while possibly impacting how business operates. Balfour said, quote, "These changes also have the potential to alter people's behavior. For example, certain service workers could lower the price they charge for their service and instead collect much more in tips in order to avoid taxes. HR departments could also get creative in classifying overtime hours in order to avoid taxes." That is one of many pieces of legislation that we are tracking here in the busy early part of the 2025 long session out of the North Carolina General Assembly. We'll continue to keep an eye on this and all of the other legislation coming out of Raleigh. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. Over the last couple of weeks, we have covered some of the ongoings in Raleigh at the General Assembly, and we'll continue to track those details for the months to come as we get into the summer and late summer months. There's always been questions about transparency within government, whether that be local, federal, or at the state level. To get some more details on the state level of transparency, Dr. Andy Jackson from the John Locke Foundation joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Andy, I think everybody likes the term and hears transparency and they think it's a good thing, rightfully so. But when the rubber meets the road, why should voters and why should residents of North Carolina care about transparency in regards to the GA? How does it affect my life?
Well, there's a couple of parts to that answer. And of course, government at all levels touches all of our lives. Whether or not we care about the government cares about us, as they say. And there's two aspects of it. One, research has shown, to put it succinctly, more transparent governments govern better. If people in positions of power know that they're being watched, that they're being recorded, that stuff that they say or do could come back to haunt them later on at the next election or the next time they're considered for being hired for a different position. If they're in the bureaucracy, they're more likely to keep their ducks in a row and behave according to the laws and norms of society. So that's the one part of it. And the other part is, I'm gonna steal a line from Patrick Henry here, is that the liberties of people never were nor never will be secure when the transactions of their rulers are concealed from them. In other words, not only is transparency important for making government better for helping our lives as needed, but it's also better at helping us protect ourselves from government. So for both of those reasons, it's better to have transparency in government.
Now, Andy, if I go to the North Carolina legislative website, I can view a video stream or an audio stream when the House or Senate are in session. So it seems like there's already some transparency there. What part of this process in regards to transparency is really the issue here in North Carolina?
Yeah, that's true. And in our research, I've said that the General Assembly is not a black hole of darkness on information, but there are things that can be better. And there are some specific things. Generally, the General Assembly is pretty good on open meetings, but not so much on public records. And it has actually gotten worse recently. As part of the budget that was passed in 2023, the General Assembly said that the curator of legislative records can decide whether or not any record in their possession is a public record and subject to public records requests or not. The separate part of that budget said, well, who's the curator of records? The legislators themselves. And so we've made a situation now where the General Assembly, any document in their possession can be, the legislators can say, well, this is not really a public document. I don't have to divulge that, even if requested to do so.
Well, and we see a lot of this at the more federal level, and it happens sometimes at the local level, counties or cities, where individuals do request this information, and we find email exchanges and various information flowing back and forth between city council or county commissioners. That comes out, and sometimes there's some pretty big news in there. Andy, is from what you're telling us, that doesn't happen as often at the GA level because they can essentially say these records aren't public.
Right now, it's completely voluntary. For other parts of the government, at least in theory, if they have a record and somebody makes a request to receive that record, I regularly make public records requests, for example, to the State Board of Elections to see like how is this rule getting enforced? Where are the results? I'm getting some data from them. But the legislature is not subject to those same requirements because they've essentially exempted themselves. Now, there are members of the legislature who will voluntarily turn over records, but we really need to get back into a regime where it's expected and required that they do so. And nobody's talking about turning over, say, personnel records or some private information of constituents so people can dox somebody who might be complaining to the government. But there are a lot of records in the possession of legislators that really ought to be made publicly available, at least upon request.
So how did we get to this position and this point that we are now where the legislators themselves are the ones deciding whether something should be released or not? Has that always been the case in North Carolina?
Yes, certainly not. I mean, well, one, in the deep, deep past, yes, but we have developed public records laws in North Carolina. We've developed open meetings laws in North Carolina. Those apply to the legislature as well as state and local entities, up and down the kind of federalism tree, if you will. And so what happened, this was a specific records denial, essentially, within the 2023 budget. And that was shortly before we had redistricting. And the theory is that legislators, certainly on the Republican side, they wanted to keep documents related to redistricting where they were sharing information about how should we draw these districts, keep that out of the public eye, make it so that you couldn't get it for maybe potential lawsuits later on. And that's the basic rationale that I've seen heard for that. But this has gone well beyond that. And so we're still in that same regime where any document that a legislator possesses can still be made private, even if it normally would be something that would be a public document subject to a public records request.
We'll continue the conversation with Dr. Andy Jackson from the John Locke Foundation coming up after this. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. And welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you as we continue our discussion this morning on new legislation being introduced in the General Assembly in regards to taxes. House Bill 14 has also been introduced, and it seeks to correct an inconsistency in North Carolina's tax law related to gambling losses. Under current state law, gamblers are required to pay taxes on their winnings without deducting losses, even if their net income is zero or negative. The bill was introduced by Wake County Representative Erin Perret. She said in regards to the legislation, quote, "This bill is about ensuring a fair income tax environment in North Carolina that is consistent with the North Carolina Constitution and federal law. The North Carolina Constitution says that the state should tax net income, not gross income." Perret explained that if someone bets $1,000 and wins $500, they shouldn't be taxed on the $500 in so-called winnings because their net income is actually zero. Federal law allows gamblers to deduct the losses capped at what an individual actually won, but state law currently does not. Perret acknowledged that while this bill enjoys strong support in the House, there may be some division over concerns that it could be seen as promoting gambling. However, she emphasized that the bill's purpose is to prevent taxpayers from being unfairly taxed on income that they never actually received. That is another piece of legislation that we are tracking, House Bill 14. You can read more details this morning on that and all of the other stories we talk about by visiting our website, carolinajournal.com. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. We are continuing our discussion this morning with Dr. Andy Jackson from the John Locke Foundation about transparency within the General Assembly and why that is relevant to you as you go through your daily life. Andy, one of the things that I've seen, at least online and maybe rumbled by members of the General Assembly, is that from a resource standpoint, it is very expensive to provide these records. Most members of the General Assembly have one legislative assistant, and it's not practical for them to be constantly fulfilling and dealing with public records requests on top of all of the other work that those legislative assistants do. In your mind, you have mentioned you request documents from governments all the time. Is that a valid excuse from the GA?
No, not really. I mean, there are rules in place if you're making a super large request that's requiring a lot of documents. I've paid for a couple $100 once for a records request, but that was admittedly several boxes of papers that they had to print out. A lot of this is just a search function that you have to do. If somebody's making a request of emails on particular words on a particular date, that'll take a little bit of time, but this is not going to be extraordinarily large request usually. And if there is a method in place to make a reasonable purchase price for that if it does take a large amount of time. In my discussion leading up to a report that we did last year on reforms to the General Assembly, we discovered that most legislators only deal with a relative handful, less than a dozen public records requests in a year. Sometimes, and this happens sometimes with members of the media where they're basically testing legislators and they'll say, give me all your emails in July. And I can see how that gets irritating, and that may stick in the head of some legislators and say, well, this is my bad example of somebody. They're not really asking for information. They're just seeing how transparent I'm going to be on this particular request. It can be irritating, but I think the importance of transparency as far as, once again, protecting our liberties, helping ensure good governance is clearly outweighs those other factors. So yes, there can be some caveats you could attach to it, but the basic answer is we got to have more transparency. People should have access to the documents that government officials have.
Well, Andy, up in Congress, there's always this discussion about term limits, and that would, of course, require members that are elected in those positions to put term limits on members of the House and the Senate. Not too dissimilar of a situation here. We would be asking members of the General Assembly to pass legislation that would directly affect them. Do we expect any movement on something like this as we head into the 2025 long session? Where do we stand right now?
It can be a big ask. I'm not saying that this is going to be easy. In our research, we found, I don't have the exact quote, but basically government officials don't give up information because they want to. They do it because they have to. And so I think there's a couple of aspects to that. One is it's going to take some public pressure at least. Two, one thing you have is that's always consistent is that the party out of power generally tends to be very sunshine friendly. And so you've got some baked in votes there, obviously a minority currently, but that means you only have to get a kind of subsection of Republicans on board for a greater transparency regime. And plus, if we do get in a situation where, say, the tides shift and Republicans are maybe not quite as sure that they'll be able to hold on to majorities, then they'll be more likely to vote for something. If it's one side that always thinks, well, we're going to always have the power, then they'll want to support that power. But if they think maybe the other side's going to have that share or that shot at it later on, they might want to say, well, if we're out of power, what do we want from the other side? So this may be a long-term effort. A lot of times when you do reform of the legislature, it is. I think it's worth the effort. And I think the first thing we can do is try to get a clawback of that provision in the budget so that we can have more legislative records subject to public records requests. And then a longer term thing is to have a constitutional amendment that has a couple of factors. One, you need a supermajority to carve out an exception for the legislature. And two, you have what you call a clearly outweighs standard, which basically means if we end up with a lawsuit over public records, unless there's something like personnel records, like medical records, that sort of thing, where the right to privacy or keeping something secret clearly outweighs the need for public exposure. If you don't meet that standard, then there's a presumption that you're going to have to make the record public.
And you just kind of mentioned this in regards to the media. Is one of the issues with the transparency here, Andy, the fact that the general public is not, first of all, not tracking the General Assembly super close day in and day out. They really don't have any idea. And in most cases, 99% of them will never submit a public records request, will never interface with government like that. Is that part of the issue here as well?
I think definitely is. There's a small set of people, researchers and activists like myself, members of the media that are most interested. In that sense, we're kind of the front end here because we're the groups that are providing the information for the general public. Most people really don't even know how to submit a public records request, for example. And so these are things you have to learn through bumping your head. Same thing with people dealing with local government. Until you wonder why can't I get the pothole in my street fixed? Then you start worrying, like, what is my city government doing with my money? Why aren't they getting people to do what they're supposed to do with the property taxes I pay every year? And so, until you get to that point, you don't really know what the problem is. And if you don't know what the problem is, you can't really ask about it.
Andy, you've got a report out back a couple of weeks ago that's got some more details on that. Where can folks find that this morning?
Well, the easiest way to do it is go to the John Locke webpage. That is John Locke, LOCKE, like the man.org, and then you can research Reforming North Carolina's General Assembly.
Thanks for the time this morning. Dr. Andy Jackson from the John Locke Foundation joins us on the Carolina Journal News Hour. And welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good Friday morning to you. Don't forget that you can take the show on demand on your own time by checking out our podcast. It's available wherever you get your shows. Just search for the Carolina Journal News Hour, tap the subscribe and follow button, and you'll get a new show delivered to your smartphone or tablet each and every weekday morning. It's the Carolina Journal News Hour podcast. Download and subscribe now. We are continuing our discussion this morning on the new legislation that is being introduced in the General Assembly, and we'll turn our attention to some legislation introduced by Senators Ralph Heiss of Mitchell County, Todd Johnson of Union County, and Buck Newton of Wilson County. They filed a bill this week that would end allowing state employees to automatically pay association dues straight from their paychecks. This would apply to members of employee associations like the state's two largest, the North Carolina Association of Educators, NCAE, and the State Employees Association of North Carolina, SEANAC, SEANC. North Carolina Senate Bill 47 is titled State Employees No Payroll Due Deductions, and it proposes repealing a provision that allows state employees to authorize payroll deductions for payments to employee associations. Specifically, it amends portions of the general statute. It removes subsection G, which, quote, currently permits such payroll deductions for members of qualifying employee associations, those who have more than 2,000 members. Brian Balfour, the Senior Vice President of Research at the John Locke Foundation, says, quote, the repeal of payroll due deductions is long overdue. State government should not have been providing this service to employee associations, using taxpayer dollars to help funnel state worker dollars into associations that are often highly political. This bill would make it somewhat more difficult for these associations to collect dues, which is why they will be outraged about it. Member dues is the source of their political power, not to mention what pays the often lofty salaries of the association's leadership. If enacted, this change would eliminate the option for state employees to have association dues automatically deducted from their paychecks. And according to a North Carolina state auditor report filed in the fall with reporting data from 2023, the State Employees Association of North Carolina has over 40,000 members, while the North Carolina Association of Educators has about 25,500 members there as well. An additional 10 associations serve various other employee groups in the state, and this could be a major change for these employee unions. You can read more details on this story this morning by visiting our website, carolinajournal.com. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. We are continuing our coverage of the 2025 long session out of the North Carolina General Assembly in Raleigh. Brianna Kraemer, carolinajournal.com, joins us this morning on the News Hour. We're talking about constitutional carry. There's been movement in both the House and the Senate on those details. Brianna, tell us what you're following in regards to that.
Yes, good morning. Hey, Nick. We are talking about constitutional carry and if North Carolina can become the 30th state to approve permitless carry. So Republicans in the North Carolina General Assembly are pushing to legalize constitutional carry across the state this legislative session in a new bill that was filed in the House last week with 26 sponsors. So House Bill 5 was filed, and it brings up the issue of constitutional carry. And if approved, we would become the 30th state to allow gun owners to carry their weapon concealed without a permit in North Carolina. So the House filed that last week. And then this week on Tuesday, the Senate filed a similar bill legalizing constitutional carry. And very interesting about the Senate side, where, they've kind of struggled to push this through in past sessions. Senate Leader Phil Berger is one of the co-sponsors of the bill. So we are definitely looking at some action in the state legislature this session when it comes to permitless carry.
Brianna, can you explain the difference between what we currently have on the books right now and what would change if constitutional carry were to go forward in the House and the Senate and then the governor were to sign it into law? What exactly would change for residents and citizens here across the state?
Yeah, so it would basically just allow people to carry a gun, their own firearm, without needing a permit or having to go through any kind of legal class or anything like is required in many states right now. And North Carolina is one of them. If you want to carry it on you concealed, every state has different laws when it comes to the Second Amendment. And so one of the main sponsors, Representative Keith Kidwell, he was explaining this to me. And he said, people have a God-given right to self-defense. It's codified in the Second Amendment, and it's in 29 states at this point. He also pointed to the fact that statistics show the FBI consistently, when they went to concealed carry permits, crime dropped. And then when we went to constitutional carry, also crime dropped again. So there's Republicans that are for it, but in past sessions, we've seen that some are more hesitant about it too. And then Democrats typically don't seem to be in favor of it, but we will see. It seems like there could be more potential this session for action on it, but of course then comes up the issue of the governor and the support that we would need from the executive branch to get this across the finish line.
I think it's fair to say this morning that if this were to move in the House and the Senate, it seems like it's got a pretty strong backing from what you're telling us on the Senate side. There's almost 0% chance that the governor would sign this into law, presumably setting up maybe some early veto overrides this session?
Well, that's the question that remains up in the air. I mean, last session, the House and the Senate did have supermajority powers where they were able to override Governor Cooper's vetoes. But this session, the House obviously lost one seat, and so they don't technically have that unless they, get some support from Democrat colleagues. So, I think it would be more of a struggle this session. And so that's the question people were also raising online is, why didn't you do this last year? Why didn't you do this when you actually had a better chance of getting it to the finish line and being able to override the governor? Because now it seems like the Senate is more on board this year, but the chances of it going through, at least on the House side, I'm not sure if the chances are as great as they were in previous sessions.
Now, for individuals that might be hearing this morning and are not super familiar with firearm laws, this would not remove any sort of federal background checks or systems that folks would have to go through to purchase things like a pistol, correct? This would just be not going through a CCW class to carry it concealed. You'd still have to pass a background check and go through those federal systems that are in place.
Yeah, that's right. There's still federal processes that we'd have to follow. The bill's text says an act to protect a person's right to carry a concealed handgun without a permit. So that is the gist of what this would do. The House and Senate bills vary slightly in exactly what they're targeting, but for the constitutional carry purposes, it is simply to allow a concealed handgun without a permit.
And Brianna, where can folks read more on this story? I know you've got some quotes from some lawmakers, including some comments from Senator Vicky Sawyer. Where can folks find that?
Yeah, go to carolinajournal.com and you can read the full story there.
A great update this morning. Brianna Kraemer joins us on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Good morning again, and welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. We are tracking some legislation, this time in the U.S. Senate. Many of you listening this morning on AM radio. Well, Wednesday morning, earlier this week, the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation passed the AM Radio in Every Vehicle Act. The proposed legislation, which would ensure that consumers can maintain access to AM radio in new vehicles sold in the U.S., can now move forward for a full Senate vote. Just hours after the Senate committee finalized its vote, the bill was also reintroduced in the House of Representatives. The legislation was previously passed by the Senate Commerce Committee in July of 2023, as well as the House Energy and Commerce Committee in September of 2024, and many legislators have expressed support. Yet backers could not get it across the finish line at the end of the most recent congressional term in December. Obviously, there was a lot going on at that time. You had a potential government shutdown, a changing administration, and while this legislation, as is noted in the article here, does have some very strong support, it was obviously not on the top mind of legislators. Senator Ed Markey, a Democrat, and Republican Ted Cruz reintroduced the bill just last week, January the 29th, with 40 Senate co-sponsors. Following the Senate's committee's passage of the AM bill, Markey and Cruz released a joint statement applauding the move. They said in a combined statement, quote, "Today's vote to advance the AM Radio for Every Vehicle Act broadcasts a clear message to car manufacturers that AM radio is an essential communication tool for millions of Americans across the country. From emergency response to sports, entertainment, and news, AM radio is a lifeline that must be protected. Our bill ensures that no one is cut off from their communities and that AM radio stays a part of our constituents' daily lives. The new FCC chairman and Brandon Carr also weighed in on the legislation, saying that millions of Americans depend on AM radio and local news to support their communities. Carr said this: "Just last week, I visited parts of North Carolina that had been hit hard by Hurricane Helene. And I heard firsthand stories of people that could only access life-saving information in the days following the storm by tuning their radios to the AM band. By ensuring that AM radio remains in new vehicles, legislation will help keep this linchpin of our emergency response system in place and also ensure that Americans can continue to access relevant news, information, and entertainment programming. I hope the full Senate can move this bill forward quickly." In a divisive political climate where the media landscape is being closely scrutinized and criticized by the new administration, this is one of few bills that can claim some bipartisan support from both the FCC and the new commissioner there, Brandon Carr, and Congress. The National Association of Broadcasters has long been a steward of the legislation. Earlier this week, NAB President and CEO Curtis Ligeti said in a statement, quote, "In just 1 week since its introduction, this legislation has already gained nearly half of the Senate as co-sponsors and cleared a key committee, demonstrating the broad recognition of AM radio's vital role in keeping Americans informed and safe." He continued by saying AM radio is the backbone of the emergency alert system, providing a resilient and reliable communication lifeline. We urge the full Senate to move quickly to pass this legislation to ensure AM radio remains accessible to all Americans. In the House, Representative Gus Birrix of Florida and the House Energy Committee and Commerce Ranking Member Frank Pallone of New Jersey reintroduced the AM Radio in Every Vehicle Act in the House side. And according to NAB, in the last Congress, the House committee advanced the bill by a decisive 45-2 vote and garnered the support of more than 250 House members and more than 125 third-party organizations. As many of you are well aware, AM radio continues to be a lifeline, and kind of harping back on the comments from FCC Chairman Brandon Carr when he talked about his visit to North Carolina and the amount of individuals that absolutely could only get AM radio in the days following Helene, when the cell phone networks were down, when the internet service was completely scattered and not available. You had just a few radio stations broadcasting in some of those markets in western North Carolina, many of them being AM stations, and they absolutely provided a pivotal lifeline for those individuals that, of course, went through so much during Helene and continue to deal with it now. We will track this legislation out of Congress and provide details and updates as soon as we get them right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Now, turning our attention to the North Carolina General Assembly this morning, Republicans there are pushing to legalize constitutional carry across the state in this legislative session with a new bill filed. It's House Bill 5, and it aims to bring constitutional carry or permitless concealed carry to the state of North Carolina. If approved, the state would become the 30th in the nation to allow gun owners to carry their weapons without a permit. And according to Representative Keith Kidwell, the Republican out of Beaufort County, he says, quote, "Statistics show from the FBI consistently when we went to concealed carry permits, crime dropped. And when we went to constitutional carry, crime dropped again. An armed society is a polite society. People have a God-given right to self-defense. It's codified in the Second Amendment, and it's codified in 29 states at this point. The bill would also authorize elected state officials to carry concealed firearms while permitting official duties if that individual has a concealed handgun permit. In the last legislative session, a constitutional carry bill made some progress in the House negotiations, but ultimately failed to gain traction after Senate leaders expressed an unwillingness to consider it. Kidwell expressed optimism about the bill moving forward this session, noting that a senator has asked him for a copy of the legislation and intends to run a companion bill, or essentially take the same legislation and also run it in the North Carolina Senate. We know it's a topic that continues to come up. Obviously, some major power shifts this year for Republicans. They do no longer have a super majority. They've got it in the Senate, but they don't have it in a House. The likelihood of Governor Josh Stein signing a piece of legislation like this, not super high. However, it is something that we will continue to track throughout the long session. We'll have details at carolinajournal.com and right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Well, that's going to do it for a Friday edition. WBT News is next, followed by Good Morning BT. We are back with you Monday morning, 5 to 6 a.m. right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT.